What if I told you that the most decisive battle of World War II wasn't fought on the beaches of Normandy, in the skies over Britain, or even in the frozen hell of Stalingrad? What if the war's true turning point happened in places like Willow Run, Michigan, and Camden, New Jersey, where the weapons weren't rifles but riveting guns, and the soldiers weren't wearing combat boots but steel-toed work shoes? History remembers the generals and the decorated soldiers, the men who charged enemy lines and flew daring missions into hostile territory. We build monuments to their courage, and rightfully so. But there's another army that won World War II, an army that never fired a shot in anger, never saw combat, and yet without whom every battle would have been lost before it began. These warriors wore overalls smeared with grease and metal shavings. They worked 16-hour shifts in factories that stretched for miles. And in one legendary instance, they built a B-24 Liberator bomber in less than 72 hours. This is the story of America's industrial miracle, of the men and women who transformed a nation still recovering from the Great Depression into what President Franklin Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. It's a story of impossible deadlines met, of production records shattered, of ordinary citizens who became extraordinary through sheer determination and ingenuity. It's the story of how America didn't just fight a war, it built one rivet by rivet, weld by weld, until the sheer weight of American industrial might crushed the ambitions of fascism under an avalanche of steel, aluminum, and unstoppable production capacity. When Hitler's forces rolled across Europe in the spring of 1940, America was not ready for war, not even close. The United States Army ranked 18th in the world in terms of size, smaller than Romania's military. The nation possessed fewer than 800 modern aircraft. Tank production was virtually non-existent. The peacetime economy, still limping along after the devastating Depression, was designed to produce consumer goods, not weapons of war. Assembly lines churned out automobiles and refrigerators, not fighter planes and artillery shells. But on December 7, 1941, when Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, everything changed. Within days, America declared war on both Japan and Germany. And with that declaration came a challenge unprecedented in human history. How do you transform an entire nation's industrial capacity from peace to war in a matter of months? How do you build the tanks, ships, and planes necessary to fight enemies on two fronts, separated by vast oceans, while also supplying allies who had already been bleeding for years? The answer would require nothing less than a complete reimagining of American manufacturing. It would demand that automobile factories stop building cars and start building bombers. It would require housewives to become welders, teenagers to become machinists, and the elderly to return to factory floors they thought they'd left behind forever. The task seemed impossible, but America had something that neither Germany nor Japan could match: an industrial infrastructure built on innovation, mass production techniques perfected during peacetime, and most importantly, a workforce willing to sacrifice everything for victory. Here's the intriguing reality that defined this moment. The outcome of World War II was never going to be determined solely by who had the bravest soldiers or the most brilliant generals. It would be determined by who could produce more. More planes, more tanks, more ships, more bullets. The war would be won in Detroit and Pittsburgh as surely as it would be won in Berlin and Tokyo. And the workers who punched time clocks instead of parachuting behind enemy lines would prove just as essential to victory as the Marines who raised the flag on Iwo Jima. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated. America faced enemies who had been preparing for war for years. Germany had been rearming since Hitler took power in 1933. Japan had been on a war footing since invading Manchuria in 1931. These nations had built formidable military machines, and by the time America entered the war, they controlled vast territories and resources. Germany dominated continental Europe from France to the outskirts of Moscow. Japan controlled much of China and was rapidly conquering Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The Axis powers appeared unstoppable, and America appeared woefully unprepared to challenge them. Yet within this apparent weakness lay hidden strength. America's peacetime industrial capacity, though not designed for war, was the most advanced and productive in the world. American factories had pioneered mass production techniques that made goods affordable and available to ordinary citizens in ways no other nation could match. The assembly line methods developed by Henry Ford and others had created unprecedented efficiency. American engineers had decades of experience solving complex manufacturing problems. American workers had developed skills operating sophisticated machinery. All of this existed, ready to be redirected toward military production once the necessary transformation began. The foundation for America's wartime industrial miracle was laid decades before Pearl Harbor, in the factories and workshops where American ingenuity had already revolutionized manufacturing. Henry Ford's assembly line had made the automobile accessible to average Americans. Frederick Winslow Taylor's scientific management principles had transformed how factories organized labor. These innovations, born from capitalism and competition, had created the world's most efficient manufacturing system. Now, that system would be turned toward a singular purpose: winning the war. But transforming that capability into reality required more than just repurposing existing factories. It required a level of coordination between government and industry that America had never attempted before. In the early months of 1942, as news from the war fronts grew increasingly dire, Washington created new agencies with sweeping powers. The War Production Board could mandate what factories produced, allocate raw materials, set prices, and essentially direct the entire economy toward military production. It was the closest America had ever come to a command economy, and yet it worked precisely because it harnessed rather than replaced the competitive spirit of American business. Donald Nelson, who led the War Production Board, faced an almost impossible challenge. He had to coordinate the conversion of thousands of factories, manage the allocation of scarce raw materials, resolve conflicts between military branches competing for resources, and somehow maintain enough civilian production to prevent economic collapse. The learning curve was steep, mistakes were frequent, and the pressure was relentless. Yet Nelson and his team managed to create a system that, despite its imperfections, ultimately delivered the weapons needed for victory. The automotive industry became ground zero for this transformation. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, companies that had spent decades perfecting the art of building cars, now faced a completely different challenge. Building an automobile involved perhaps 15,000 parts. Building a B-24 Liberator bomber required over 1 million. An automobile weighed about 2 tons. A bomber weighed 30,000 pounds empty. The precision required was vastly different, yet these companies, along with hundreds of suppliers and subcontractors, had to make the shift almost overnight. Consider the scale of what was being asked. Ford's massive River Rouge complex in Dearborn, Michigan, employed over 100,000 workers across 2,000 acres. This sprawling facility, which could take in raw materials at one end and output completed automobiles at the other, represented the pinnacle of industrial efficiency. Now, Ford was being asked to build something entirely new. The company had never manufactured an aircraft. Its engineers had never worked with the specialized aluminum alloys required for aviation. Its workforce had no experience with the exacting tolerances demanded by aircraft construction. And yet, by the spring of 1942, Ford had committed to building one B-24 bomber every single hour. To accomplish this seemingly impossible goal, Ford constructed an entirely new facility, Willow Run. Located in Ypsilanti Township, Michigan, the plant was a monument to ambition and engineering. The main assembly building stretched for over 3 million square feet under a single roof, making it the largest room in the world at the time. The building was so vast that it had its own internal weather. Clouds would occasionally form near the ceiling on humid days. A worker could clock in at one end and need to take a bus to reach their workstation at the other end, a journey that could take 15 minutes. The construction of Willow Run itself was an engineering marvel that deserves recognition. Ground broke in April 1942, and the first bomber rolled off the line just 6 months later in September. Building the facility required 41 million board feet of lumber, 27 million bricks, and nearly 400,000 cubic yards of concrete. The scale was unprecedented, the timeline impossibly compressed, yet the project was completed through round-the-clock construction work involving thousands of workers who understood that every day of delay meant soldiers going into combat without adequate air support. But size alone wouldn't win the war. What made Willow Run revolutionary was how Ford applied automotive mass production principles to aircraft manufacturing. Traditional aircraft production involved teams of skilled craftsmen, essentially hand-building each plane. Different sections would be constructed simultaneously in various parts of a factory, then brought together for final assembly. It was closer to custom manufacturing than mass production, with each aircraft requiring individual attention and adjustment. Ford threw out that entire approach. Instead, they created a moving assembly line for bombers, just as they had for Model Ts decades earlier. Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief, masterminded this transformation. Sorensen was a gruff, demanding manager who had spent his entire career at Ford, rising from pattern maker to one of the most powerful executives in American industry. He understood manufacturing at a fundamental level, possessed an intuitive grasp of how complex processes could be broken down into simple, repeatable steps. Sorensen understood that aircraft manufacturing would have to change fundamentally if America was to produce planes in the quantities needed. He envisioned breaking down bomber construction into thousands of small, repetitive tasks that could be performed by workers with minimal training. Rather than requiring years of experience, workers could learn their specific job in days or weeks. This approach was controversial. Aircraft manufacturers scoffed that bombers were too complex for mass production, but Sorensen knew it would work because the principles were sound. The bomber would move along the line and workers at each station would perform specific, repetitive tasks. One team would install the electrical systems, running miles of wiring through the aircraft's frame, according to diagrams that showed exactly where each wire belonged. The next would add hydraulics, the complex system of pumps and lines that controlled everything from landing gear to bomb bay doors. Another would mount the engines, the massive Pratt & Whitney radials that would pull the bomber through hostile skies. Like a ballet performed by tens of thousands of workers, each movement precisely choreographed, the B-24 would gradually take shape as it moved through the plant. By the time it reached the end of the line, roughly a mile from where it started, it would be complete, ready to be fueled, armed, and flown to war. However, the transition wasn't smooth. Willow Run experienced significant growing pains in its early months that tested everyone's faith in the project. Production fell far short of targets, sometimes producing only a handful of aircraft monthly when hundreds were needed. Quality control problems plagued early aircraft, with inspectors finding defects that required extensive rework. Workers struggled with the learning curve, unfamiliar with aircraft construction and often lacking the precision skills required. Critics dubbed the facility "Will It Run?", questioning whether Ford's approach would ever succeed. The skeptics pointed to the delays, the defects, the missed deadlines. Some called for abandoning the project entirely and returning to traditional manufacturing methods. Newspaper articles questioned whether Ford had bitten off more than it could chew, whether the automotive giant's confidence had led to a costly boondoggle. But Ford persevered, making continuous improvements to processes and training. Engineers identified bottlenecks in the production flow and redesigned workflows to eliminate delays. They discovered that certain assembly sequences worked better than others, that some components needed to be installed before others, even though initial plans suggested different ordering. Supervisors developed better training programs, creating detailed instructional materials and hands-on demonstrations that helped workers master their specific tasks. Workers themselves contributed ideas for improvements, suggesting tool modifications and technique adjustments that increased efficiency and quality. Slowly, production increased. By mid-1943, Willow Run was producing dozens of bombers monthly. By early 1944, production exceeded 100 aircraft per month. By summer 1944, the plant was producing over 400 bombers monthly, finally meeting and exceeding the ambitious targets set years earlier. The transformation of American industry extended far beyond Willow Run. Across the country, factories underwent similar conversions. General Motors stopped building Buicks and Chevrolets and started producing tanks, aircraft engines, and artillery shells. The company's manufacturing prowess was redirected entirely toward military production, contributing more to the war effort than any other single corporation. Chrysler built tanks at the Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant, a massive facility constructed specifically for armor production. The factory covered 113 acres under one roof and employed thousands of workers who had never seen a tank before the war began. Shipbuilding experienced equally dramatic transformation. Before the war, American shipyards were relatively small operations, building vessels slowly using traditional methods. Henry Kaiser changed everything. Kaiser was a construction magnate who had never built a ship before the war, but understood mass production and wasn't bound by shipbuilding traditions. His yards on the West Coast revolutionized naval construction by applying industrial manufacturing principles. Ships were built in sections that could be prefabricated in different parts of the yard, then assembled rapidly using massive cranes. Welding replaced riveting as the primary method of joining steel plates, which was faster and required less skilled labor. Workers were trained quickly in specific tasks rather than learning the complete craft of shipbuilding. The results were extraordinary. Kaiser's yards produced Liberty ships, cargo vessels designed for maximum production speed rather than longevity or elegance, in time frames that seemed impossible. The record was set in November 1942 when the Robert E. Peary was built in less than 5 days from keel laying to launch. 5 days to build a cargo ship, over 400 feet long, capable of carrying 10,000 tons of cargo. Traditional shipbuilding required 6 months to a year for such a vessel. Kaiser's methods reduced construction time to weeks, and in exceptional demonstrations to days. These Liberty ships weren't beautiful. Sailors joked they were ugly ducklings held together with prayer. The ships were basic, utilitarian, designed for mass production rather than elegance or longevity. They were expected to survive perhaps 5 years of service, not the decades traditional ships lasted, but they worked. They carried millions of tons of supplies across oceans, sustained Britain through the darkest days of the U-boat campaign, supplied the Soviet Union through dangerous Arctic convoys, and supported every American military operation. When German submarines sank Liberty ships, more were available to replace them. American shipyards launched vessels faster than submarines could sink them, which meant the Atlantic supply line never broke, despite grievous losses. At the heart of America's industrial mobilization was a concept that sounds simple, but proved revolutionary in practice: the democratization of war production. This wasn't about a few large corporations cranking out weapons. It was about transforming the entire nation into a vast interconnected manufacturing network, where even the smallest machine shop could contribute to victory. The statistics are staggering, almost beyond comprehension. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced roughly 300,000 aircraft. Think about that number for a moment. 300,000 planes in 4 years. That's more than 200 aircraft every single day for 4 straight years. American shipyards launched nearly 90,000 naval vessels, from massive aircraft carriers displacing tens of thousands of tons to small patrol boats. Factories produced over 88,000 tanks, over 2.5 million trucks, over 600,000 jeeps. American industry manufactured 40 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. 40 billion. That's enough bullets to circle the Earth multiple times if laid end to end. But these numbers, as impressive as they are, don't fully capture the human element of this achievement. Each of those aircraft represented thousands of hours of labor. Each tank, each ship, each bullet was the product of human hands, human ingenuity, human determination. The people who made this miracle happen came from every corner of American society, and their stories reveal profound truths about what human beings can accomplish when united by purpose. Women became welders, machinists, and engineers in numbers that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. Before the war, cultural norms and explicit discrimination had barred women from most industrial jobs. The factory floor was considered men's domain. Manufacturing work was viewed as inappropriate for women, too physically demanding, too dirty, too dangerous. Women belonged in homes or in appropriate female occupations like teaching, nursing, or secretarial work. Factory managers claimed women lacked the physical strength for industrial work, that their presence would distract male workers, that they were inherently unsuited for mechanical tasks. These attitudes were deeply entrenched, supported by both cultural tradition and deliberate corporate policy that excluded women from all but the most menial factory positions. But with millions of men shipping overseas to fight, factories faced a critical labor shortage that threatened the entire war effort. The solution was as obvious as it was revolutionary: recruit women. The government launched massive propaganda campaigns encouraging women to take factory jobs, presenting war work as patriotic duty. The iconic figure of Rosie the Riveter emerged as both propaganda and reality, symbolizing the millions of women who answered the call. "We can do it," declared the posters, showing a determined woman flexing her arm, and women responded by the millions. By 1945, women constituted over 1/3 of the civilian workforce, with millions working in war production. They operated massive cranes that lifted multi-ton components, welded steel plates on ship hulls in positions that required physical stamina and steady hands, assembled intricate aircraft components, requiring precision and attention to detail. and tested dangerous equipment, knowing that their safety depended on following procedures exactly. They worked night shifts and day shifts in sweltering summer factories where temperatures exceeded 100 degrees and freezing winter plants where heating was inadequate. They proved, beyond any possible doubt, that gender had nothing to do with capability. The work was just as hard for women as for men, the hours just as long, the dangers just as real. Yet they persevered, driven by patriotism, economic necessity, and for many, the simple satisfaction of doing important work well. Will Monroe, one of the real-life inspirations for Rosie the Riveter, worked as a riveter at Willow Run building B-24s. Her husband had died in a car accident, leaving her to raise 2 daughters alone. She needed work, and America needed workers. The war brought them together in a relationship that benefited both. Rose became so proficient at her job that she was featured in promotional films encouraging other women to join the war effort, demonstrating riveting techniques with practiced ease. Her capable hands could drive rivets as quickly and accurately as any man's, creating joints that would hold together under the stresses of combat flight. After the war, she used her earnings to start her own construction company, building houses and commercial buildings, driving a taxi on the side when construction was slow. Her story embodied the transformation the war triggered. Women had proven they could do any job, and many had no intention of returning to purely domestic roles when peace came. The experience of women in war factories varied tremendously based on region, industry, and individual circumstances. Some women encountered supportive work environments where male colleagues respected their contributions and treated them as equals. These fortunate women found mentors who taught them skills, supervisors who judged them on performance rather than gender, and workplaces where capability mattered more than preconceptions. Others faced hostility, harassment, and deliberate sabotage from men who resented their presence and saw them as threats to masculine identity and job security after the war. Women reported tools being hidden, instructions being deliberately withheld, and crude harassment that made work environments uncomfortable or hostile. Some employers made genuine efforts to accommodate working mothers, providing childcare facilities at or near factories and flexible scheduling that recognized family responsibilities. Kaiser shipyards, for example, operated nursery schools where working mothers could leave children in safe, supervised environments while they worked shifts. These facilities provided not just basic childcare, but educational activities and proper meals, recognizing that supporting workers' families was essential to maintaining productivity. Other employers offered no support, forcing women to navigate impossible demands of factory work and family responsibilities with no institutional assistance. Many women worked grueling shifts, then went home to cook, clean, and care for children with minimal help, operating on insufficient sleep and constant stress. Despite these challenges, women transformed American manufacturing. In shipyards, women welders became known for producing some of the strongest, most reliable welds, their work passing inspections at rates equal to or exceeding male welders. In aircraft factories, women's smaller hands proved advantageous for intricate assembly work in tight spaces, where men struggled to maneuver. In ammunition plants, women handled dangerous explosives with the same careful attention to safety that men did. Maintaining safety records that demonstrated capability had nothing to do with gender. The notion that women were inherently unsuited for industrial work was thoroughly demolished by their actual performance under the most demanding conditions imaginable. African Americans found both opportunity and continued discrimination in war factories, navigating a complex landscape where economic opportunity coexisted with persistent racism. The defense industry initially resisted hiring black workers despite severe labor shortages, maintaining the racist employment practices that had long characterized American industry. Factory owners claimed that white workers wouldn't accept black colleagues, that customers would object, that black workers lacked necessary skills or reliability. These excuses masked simple racism, the same prejudice that had denied black Americans equal opportunity throughout American history. It took direct intervention from the federal government, specifically President Roosevelt's Executive Order 8802 in June 1941, which banned discriminatory hiring practices in defense industries, to begin opening factory doors to black workers. The order came only after A. Philip Randolph, leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, threatened to organize a massive march on Washington to protest defense industry discrimination. Randolph had spent years organizing black railroad workers and understood the power of collective action. He proposed bringing 100,000 black Americans to Washington to demand equal access to defense jobs, a demonstration that would have been deeply embarrassing for Roosevelt as he tried to position America as defender of freedom and democracy. Roosevelt, fearing the political and diplomatic embarrassment of such a march, while proclaiming American dedication to freedom, issued the executive order and established the Fair Employment Practices Committee to enforce it. Even then, the path was far from smooth. Black workers frequently faced segregated facilities within factories, forced to use separate restrooms, eating areas, and locker rooms even though they worked alongside white colleagues. They received discriminatory pay scales, earning less than white workers for identical jobs. They encountered hostile work environments where white workers refused to cooperate. Supervisors assigned them the hardest and dirtiest jobs, and advancement opportunities were virtually non-existent regardless of capability or performance. White workers sometimes went on strike rather than work alongside black colleagues, particularly in Detroit, where racial tensions ran high and competition for jobs and housing created explosive conditions. The Sojourner Truth Housing Project riot in Detroit in February 1942, where white residents violently opposed black families moving into a federal housing project built for war workers, illustrated the vicious racism that black Americans confronted even while contributing to the war effort. White mobs attacked moving vans carrying black families' possessions, throwing rocks and threatening violence. Police initially sided with white rioters rather than protecting black residents. The violence continued for weeks before federal intervention finally allowed black families to occupy the housing project. This incident revealed how deeply racism was embedded in American society and how resistant many white Americans were to any challenge to racial hierarchy, even when that hierarchy undermined the war effort. Yet black Americans continued to push forward, seeing war work not just as employment, but as a pathway towards civil rights and economic justice. The Double V campaign, Victory Against Fascism Abroad and Victory Against Racism at Home, captured this dual struggle. Black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier championed this message, arguing that black Americans should fight for democracy overseas while also demanding it at home. How could America claim to defend freedom while denying it to millions of its own citizens based solely on skin color? How could the nation condemn Nazi racial ideology while maintaining Jim Crow segregation? These questions created cognitive dissonance that black activists exploited, using the war as leverage to demand change. The Great Migration accelerated as black Americans moved from the rural South to industrial cities in the North and West, seeking both jobs and escape from Jim Crow segregation. Cities like Detroit, Los Angeles, Oakland, and Chicago saw their black populations surge dramatically. Detroit's black population nearly doubled during the war years, growing from about 150,000 to over 300,000. Los Angeles experienced similar growth as black Americans from Texas, Louisiana, and other southern states migrated west seeking employment in aircraft factories and shipyards. These workers became welders, machinists, and assembly line workers, contributing their labor to the arsenal of democracy, while simultaneously laying groundwork for the civil rights movement that would emerge after the war. The industrial mobilization also revealed the power of American innovation under pressure, the capacity to solve problems that seemed insurmountable through ingenuity and determination. When existing factories and production methods proved insufficient, American engineers simply invented new ones. Take aluminum production, critical for aircraft manufacturing. Aluminum's lightweight and strength made it ideal for aircraft, but producing it required enormous amounts of electricity to extract the metal from bauxite ore through an energy-intensive electrolytic process. In 1939, America produced around 300 million pounds of aluminum annually, primarily for civilian applications. By 1943, that figure had increased tenfold to 3 billion pounds. This required not just expanding existing facilities, but developing entirely new processes, building new smelters powered by massive hydroelectric projects like Grand Coulee Dam, and securing bauxite from sources as far away as South America and the Caribbean. The government invested heavily in building aluminum production capacity, constructing new facilities at locations across the country, and underwriting expansion of existing ones. The Aluminum Company of America, known as Alcoa, which had enjoyed a near monopoly on domestic production before the war through patents and market control, suddenly found itself joined by Reynolds Metals and Kaiser Aluminum as the government deliberately fostered competition to maximize production. The government financed construction of new plants that these companies would operate, accepting that monopoly concerns had to yield to production necessities. These investments paid enormous dividends, creating capacity that supported not just wartime needs, but post-war industrial growth and establishing the foundation for the aerospace industry that would emerge in subsequent decades. Or consider synthetic rubber, a challenge that seemed potentially insurmountable when first confronted. Before the war, 90% of America's rubber came from Southeast Asian plantations, particularly in British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, where climate and soil conditions were ideal for rubber trees. When Japan conquered those regions in early 1942, during their rapid expansion across the Pacific, they cut off access to this critical resource almost overnight. Rubber was essential for everything from vehicle tires to aircraft components to soldiers' boots. A single B-17 bomber required half a ton of rubber in various forms. A battleship needed 75 tons. Without rubber, the war effort would grind to a halt within months as existing stockpiles were exhausted and equipment could no longer be maintained. So America had to invent a solution under extreme time pressure. The government and private industry collaborated to develop synthetic rubber production from petroleum, leveraging chemistry and industrial processes to create artificial substitutes for natural rubber. This wasn't entirely new technology. Germany had developed synthetic rubber before the war out of necessity, given their lack of access to rubber-producing colonies, but America had never produced it at scale, and German processes were protected by patents and trade secrets. The Standard Oil Company, Goodyear, Goodrich, and other firms worked frantically to develop viable processes, combining research efforts that would normally have been proprietary. The government funded construction of massive synthetic rubber plants at locations across the country. By 1944, American factories were producing over 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually, nearly all of it from technology that barely existed 3 years earlier. The speed of this transformation was breathtaking, a testament to what American industry could accomplish when properly motivated and supported. The synthetic rubber program represented one of the great scientific and industrial achievements of the war, solving what could have been a war-losing problem through innovation and determination. After the war, synthetic rubber production continued and expanded, eventually surpassing natural rubber production and creating entirely new industries. This pattern of innovation under pressure, repeated across countless industries and products. Need more ships? Henry Kaiser revolutionized shipbuilding by applying mass production techniques never before used in naval construction. His shipyards reduced Liberty ship construction time from over 200 days, using traditional methods to under 2 weeks in some cases, using prefabrication and welding. Kaiser used assembly line principles, building ship sections simultaneously in different parts of the yard, then bringing them together for rapid final assembly. He employed welding instead of traditional riveting, which was faster, required less skilled labor, and actually created stronger joints. The Liberty ships weren't elegant. Sailors joked they were held together with leftover concrete mix, but they worked, carrying millions of tons of supplies across oceans infested with enemy submarines. Need more steel? Build new mills and convert old ones to meet demand that exceeded anything peacetime markets had required. American steel production increased from roughly 40 million tons annually before the war to over 80 million tons by 1944. This required not just running existing mills at maximum capacity, but building new blast furnaces, expanding rolling mills, improving efficiency at every stage of production, and finding new sources of iron ore from mines across the country. The steel industry operated at levels that engineers had considered impossible before the war, sustained production rates that wore out equipment faster than normal maintenance schedules anticipated, but kept the furnaces running because the alternative, steel shortages that would halt tank and ship production, was unthinkable. Need specialized alloys for aircraft engines operating under conditions no peacetime engine encountered? Develop new metallurgical processes through research that compressed years of development into months. Aircraft engines operated under extreme conditions, requiring metals that could withstand tremendous heat, stress, and vibration without failing. Existing alloys proved inadequate for high-performance military engines that operated at power levels and temperatures beyond commercial applications. American metallurgists developed new alloys and production techniques, solving problems that had no precedent in peacetime manufacturing. When existing knowledge proved insufficient, they experimented until they found solutions, working with an urgency that eliminated the leisurely research pace of peacetime development. The legendary weekend when workers at Ford's Willow Run plant built a B-24 Liberator in less than 72 hours perfectly encapsulates the spirit that defined American war production. This wasn't a normal production run following established procedures. This was a challenge, a demonstration meant to prove what was possible when everything worked perfectly, when the entire system operated at peak efficiency with every worker, every component, every process functioning in perfect synchronization. The date was March 1944. By this point, Willow Run had been producing B-24s for nearly 2 years, and the workforce had become extraordinarily proficient. The initial struggles and learning curve had been overcome through persistent effort and continuous improvement, but production targets kept increasing as the strategic bombing campaign intensified. The military needed more planes, faster. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany was reaching its peak, with 1,000-plane raids becoming routine. Bomber losses remained high despite fighter escorts and improved tactics. Every additional aircraft produced meant more bombs on target, more pressure on German industry, more likelihood of shortening the war and saving Allied lives. So Ford management, along with union representatives and government observers, decided to attempt something extraordinary, see how quickly they could complete a single bomber from start to finish if everything went perfectly. What followed was a masterclass in manufacturing excellence, a demonstration of what humans could accomplish when every element of a complex system functioned flawlessly. Every single component had to be precisely where it needed to be, exactly when it was needed. The electrical harnesses with their miles of precisely color-coded wiring, the hydraulic systems with their pumps and actuators and miles of tubing, the 4 massive Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines, each weighing over 1,500 pounds, the thousands upon thousands of rivets that would hold the aluminum skin to the airframe. Everything had to arrive at the assembly line in perfect sequence without delays or mistakes. Workers who normally operated on 8-hour shifts stayed for double or triple shifts, sustained by determination and coffee and the excitement of attempting something unprecedented. Supervisors coordinated movements like conductors leading an orchestra, where every musician had to play their part precisely on cue. Supplies were staged with military precision, positioned exactly where needed to minimize any wasted motion or time, and it worked beyond anyone's expectations. 55 minutes. That's how long it took to assemble one complete B-24 Liberator bomber from major components. Not 55 hours, 55 minutes. An aircraft weighing 30,000 pounds empty, containing over 1 million parts when you counted every rivet and wire and bolt, equipped with 4 engines producing over 4,000 horsepower combined, capable of carrying 8,000 pounds of bombs for thousands of miles, at altitudes above 20,000 feet, assembled in less than an hour from the moment the first component touched the assembly line to the moment the completed aircraft was towed off for final checks and test. Flight. Of course, this wasn't quite the full story, and Ford was careful not to misrepresent the achievement as something it wasn't. That 55-minute final assembly represented the culmination of massive preparation that had occurred over preceding weeks and months. Components had been manufactured in various parts of the vast Willow Run complex, each section built to precise specifications. Engines had been built at other plants, primarily Pratt & Whitney facilities, then shipped to Willow Run where they were prepared for installation. The airframe sections, fuselage, wings, tail assembly, had been constructed in various parts of the massive facility, each major component representing hundreds of hours of labor by teams of workers. Instruments had been calibrated, electrical systems tested for continuity and proper function, hydraulics checked for leaks, everything prepared and staged so that final assembly could proceed without interruption or problems. What the 55-minute record represented was final assembly time, the actual putting together of a complete aircraft from major components that were themselves the product of extensive prior work. But even understanding this context, the achievement was astonishing. Before Willow Run pioneered mass production of bombers, Expert craftsmen needed weeks or months to assemble a single bomber from components, a process involving constant adjustments, custom fitting, and problem solving. Ford's assembly line approach, pushed to its absolute limit with every worker performing at peak efficiency, had reduced that to under an hour. The implications were staggering. The broader point was undeniable. America had achieved something unprecedented in human history. By mid-1944, Willow Run alone was producing over 400 B-24s monthly. That's more than 13 bombers every single day, day after day, month after month, without pause. Other plants across the country were churning out B-17 flying fortresses at similar rates, along with P-51 Mustang fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts, B-29 Superfortresses, and countless other aircraft types. American skies were becoming German and Japanese nightmares, darkened by formations of bombers that seemed endless because American factories could replace losses faster than enemy fighters could shoot them down. This industrial supremacy translated directly into military advantage in ways both obvious and subtle. Consider the strategic bombing campaign against Germany, which became a defining feature of the war in Europe. American and British bombers pounded German industry day and night in relentless campaigns that grew larger and more devastating as the war progressed. They destroyed factories, disrupted supply lines, damaged transportation networks, and forced Germany to divert enormous resources to air defense. Resources that couldn't be used on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union or to build tanks and aircraft for offensive operations. Germany could never match Allied bombing capacity because they simply couldn't build bombers in sufficient numbers. German industry prioritized fighters to defend against Allied bombers, a defensive posture forced by American and British production superiority. This meant sacrificing bomber production and offensive capability. When a Luftwaffe aircraft was destroyed, and German losses were catastrophic by mid-war, replacing its strained German manufacturing, which operated under constant Allied bombing, raw material shortages caused by loss of conquered territories, and labor constraints as men were drafted to replace horrific military casualties. When an American bomber went down over Germany, and thousands did, with crews facing some of the highest casualty rates of any American military personnel, a replacement was already rolling off a production line in Michigan or California or Kansas, and another was being assembled immediately behind it. This arithmetic of production meant that America could sustain a strategic bombing campaign of unprecedented scale and intensity despite grievous losses that would have forced any other nation to abandon the effort. The same pattern held across every category of equipment, creating cumulative advantages that proved insurmountable. American shipyards produced vessels so rapidly that the U-boat campaign against Allied shipping, despite inflicting terrible casualties especially in 1942 and early 1943, when German submarines hunted in wolf packs, ultimately failed because America could build Liberty ships and other cargo vessels faster than submarines could sink them. At peak production, Henry Kaiser's shipyards were launching a new Liberty ship virtually every day. German U-boats would sink a few ships from every convoy, extracting terrible costs in lives and cargo, but dozens more would be at sea, carrying supplies to Britain and the Soviet Union, sustaining the Allies even as submarines prowled shipping lanes seeking targets. The mathematics were inexorable. Submarines couldn't sink ships fast enough to break the supply line as long as American shipyards kept producing. Tank production told a similar story, but with additional nuance that reveals the sophistication of American industrial strategy. Germany's Panzer tanks, particularly later models like the Tiger and Panther, introduced from 1943 onward, were formidable weapons, often superior in individual combat to American Sherman tanks. German armor was thicker, providing better protection against enemy fire. German guns were more powerful, capable of destroying Allied tanks at greater ranges. German optics were more precise, giving gunners better ability to acquire and track targets. In a one-on-one engagement between a Sherman and a Panther, the German tank frequently had the advantage and could destroy multiple Shermans before being knocked out itself. But America produced over 50,000 Shermans during the war, a number so vast that it's difficult to fully comprehend. Germany managed about 25,000 tanks total across all models, Panthers, Tigers, Panzer IVs, and various other types. When 10 Shermans encountered 2 Panthers in combat, which was a realistic ratio given production numbers, the Germans might destroy several American tanks through superior firepower and armor, The kill ratio often favored German armor significantly, but American crews could afford those losses because replacement tanks were constantly arriving from the United States. The industrial base could replace destroyed Shermans faster than they were lost in combat, maintaining numerical superiority even in the face of tactical defeats. German crews couldn't operate under such mathematics. Every tank they lost was almost impossible to replace given Germany's strained production capacity, dwindling resources, and disrupted supply lines. A Panther destroyed in Normandy couldn't be replaced because the factory that built it might have been bombed, the raw materials needed were unavailable, or the finished tank couldn't be transported to the front because Allied aircraft controlled the skies. This was the real genius of American war production. It wasn't just about making good equipment or even the best equipment. It was about making adequate equipment in such overwhelming quantities that quality differences became irrelevant at the strategic level. The Sherman tank wasn't the best tank of World War II. That distinction probably belongs to the German Panther for its combination of firepower, armor, and mobility, or possibly the Soviet T-34 for its revolutionary design. But the Sherman was good enough, reliable enough that it wouldn't break down constantly like some German tanks, mechanically simple enough that crews could maintain them with minimal training, and most importantly, produced in such massive numbers that American armored forces could absorb tactical losses that would have crippled Germany and still maintain overwhelming numerical superiority that won campaigns. American logistics followed similar principles, creating supply chains that functioned with a reliability and scale that enemies couldn't match. The famous Red Ball Express, truck convoys that supplied Allied forces advancing across France after D-Day, moved over 400,000 tons of supplies in just 3 months during the summer and fall of 1944. This was possible only because American factories had produced hundreds of thousands of trucks capable of such sustained operations. When trucks broke down from constant use on damaged roads, replacement parts were abundant, arriving in regular supply convoys. When vehicles were destroyed by enemy action or accidents, new ones arrived continuously from the United States. German logistics, by contrast, depended heavily on horses for much of the war, particularly on the Eastern Front. While Germany's mechanized divisions received attention in propaganda and popular imagination, the reality was that most German supply transport relied on horse-drawn wagons, a 19th century solution to 20th century warfare that couldn't match the speed and capacity of motorized logistics. American logistics ran on internal combustion engines produced in staggering quantity, vehicles that could move faster, carry more, and operate reliably in conditions that would have broken animal transport. Yet this industrial miracle came with profound moral complexities that deserve honest examination and cannot be glossed over in celebration of achievement. The same factories producing weapons for democracy maintained discriminatory practices that mocked the very freedoms America claimed to defend. Black workers faced segregation within war plants, often relegated to the hardest, dirtiest, most dangerous jobs, while white workers received better assignments and preferential treatment. Women received lower pay than men for identical work, typically earning 60% of male wages for the same job requiring the same skills and producing the same results. Japanese Americans, despite many proving their loyalty through military service in segregated units like the 442nd Regimental Combat Team that became the most decorated unit in American military history for its size and length of service, saw their communities destroyed and their property confiscated while they languished in internment camps scattered across western deserts for no reason other than their ancestry. The disconnect between America's stated ideals and lived reality created deep contradictions that thinking people on both sides of the color line found impossible to ignore. American propaganda celebrated the nation as defender of freedom and democracy against totalitarian tyranny. The Office of War Information produced countless posters, films, and radio broadcasts emphasizing American values of equality, justice, and freedom. These materials were distributed globally to contrast American democracy with Nazi racial ideology and Japanese militarism. Yet at home, Jim Crow laws still enforced racial segregation across the South and in many northern communities. Lynchings still occurred. 15 black Americans were lynched in 1942 alone, murdered by white mobs who faced no legal consequences. Discrimination remained pervasive in employment, housing, education, and every aspect of American life, creating a society where the color of one's skin determined opportunities and outcomes far more than individual capability or effort. How could America claim moral authority to lead the free world while maintaining such systematic injustice? The answer, uncomfortable as it may be to acknowledge, is that America has always embodied contradiction, speaking ideals while practicing exclusion. The nation was founded on principles asserting that all men are created equal, while permitting slavery that denied African Americans even basic humanity. It proclaimed freedom as an inalienable right, while denying women the vote for over a century after independence. It celebrated democracy, while systematically disenfranchising black citizens through violence, intimidation, literacy tests, poll taxes, and legal manipulation that made a mockery of constitutional amendments supposedly guaranteeing voting rights. World War II didn't resolve these contradictions. It exposed and intensified them, bringing them into sharp relief against the backdrop of a war fought explicitly against fascist racial ideology. The war demanded that America call upon all its citizens to contribute to victory, which meant acknowledging capabilities and humanity that racist and sexist ideologies had long denied. Once acknowledged through wartime necessity, those contributions couldn't simply be forgotten when peace arrived, though many attempted exactly that. The returning to previous conditions of discrimination and exclusion proved impossible because the war had fundamentally changed how marginalized groups saw themselves and their place in American society. Consider the experience of black veterans returning home after fighting fascism overseas. They had served in segregated units. The military remained strictly segregated throughout World War II, despite the moral contradictions, but they had fought for American freedom overseas, facing the same dangers as white soldiers, dying in the same battles. They returned home expecting that their service had earned them respect and equal treatment, that having risked their lives for the nation entitled them to first-class citizenship. Instead, they found the same racism they'd left behind, sometimes intensified by white resentment of black veterans who seemed to expect equal treatment. Black veterans were attacked for wearing their uniforms in public in some southern communities, seen as uppity for displaying pride in their military service. Isaac Woodard, a black army sergeant, was beaten and blinded by police in South Carolina in February 1946, just hours after being honorably discharged for the offense of talking back to a bus driver. Black veterans were systematically denied VA benefits available to white veterans through discriminatory administration and informal discrimination. They couldn't buy homes in many neighborhoods through restrictive covenants and discriminatory lending. They couldn't attend certain colleges, despite the GI Bill supposedly providing educational benefits. They couldn't vote in much of the South, despite the 15th Amendment supposedly guaranteeing that right. Turned away from polling places by literacy tests, administered in bad faith, poll taxes they couldn't afford, and violence threatened or delivered against those who persisted. Veterans like Medgar Evers returned from fighting fascism overseas to face racism at home and refused to accept it any longer. Evers, who had fought in the Battle of Normandy and across Europe with the 657th Port Company, came home to Mississippi determined to claim the rights he'd fought for. He tried to register to vote but was turned away by white officials who made clear that black veterans had no more rights than black civilians. He applied to the University of Mississippi Law School as part of efforts to desegregate public education, but was rejected because of his race, despite qualifications that would have ensured admission for any white applicant. Rather than accepting these injustices as previous generations had been forced to do, Evers became a civil rights organizer, eventually serving as NNAACP Field Secretary in Mississippi, where he worked tirelessly to register black voters, investigate racist violence, and organize economic boycotts until his assassination by a white supremacist in June 1963. His journey from soldier to civil rights martyr illustrated how wartime service politicized a generation of black Americans, convincing them that the democracy they defended abroad should exist at home, and that they had earned through service the right to demand it. Women who had built bombers and welded ships, who had proven their capability in the most demanding circumstances imaginable, refused to quietly retreat to purely domestic roles when peace arrived. Many wanted to continue working, having discovered satisfaction and independence in employment that domestic life alone couldn't provide. They had proven their capability beyond any possible doubt, mastering skills that pre-war society had insisted were beyond female capacity. Yet when the war ended and men returned from military service seeking employment, social pressure and explicit corporate policy pushed women out of industrial jobs to make room for veterans. The cultural message was clear and forcefully communicated. Women's wartime work had been a temporary necessity, born of emergency, not a permanent change in women's proper roles. Women belonged in homes, raising children, supporting husbands, providing domestic comfort, not competing with men for jobs and wages. The industrial jobs women had filled so capably were reserved for men, the family breadwinners who deserved priority. But the genie couldn't be entirely forced back into the bottle, despite sustained efforts to do so. Women had tasted economic independence and meaningful work outside the home. Many continued working despite social disapproval and limited opportunities, taking whatever jobs they could find in fields deemed acceptable for female employment. The expanded possibilities women had briefly enjoyed during the war became part of collective memory, a reference point for arguments about women's capabilities and proper roles. When the women's liberation movement emerged in the 1960s, activists could point to Rosie the Riveter as historical proof that women could do any work men could do, that wartime necessity had revealed the lie behind limitations supposedly based on biological differences, but actually rooted in social control and male privilege. So while America's industrial achievement during World War II deserves celebration as one of the great accomplishments in human history, it must also prompt serious reflection about the society that produced it. The workers who built the arsenal of democracy were heroes absolutely and without qualification. But they were heroes operating within a system that too often denied their full humanity, that extracted their labor while withholding equal rights and opportunities. Their achievement was magnified by the obstacles they overcame, obstacles that should never have existed in the first place, and whose existence revealed deep moral failures in American society. There's also the broader question that contemporary observers should grapple with. What does this industrial mobilization reveal about American society's capabilities and priorities, and why can't similar capacity be mobilized today? If America could build 300,000 aircraft in 4 years, when the need was clear and the threat obvious, why can't that same fundamental capacity be mobilized for other challenges facing contemporary society? Why does addressing climate change, rebuilding crumbling infrastructure, or combating poverty seem politically impossible when the nation demonstrated during World War II that seemingly impossible challenges can be overcome when collective will exists and resources are properly directed? The answer lies partly in the unique nature of World War II as a crisis that generated consensus unusual in American political life. The threat was existential, immediate, and unambiguous. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan threatened American survival in ways that left no room for legitimate debate. The enemy was clear, the danger obvious, the necessity of action beyond question. There was no substantial faction arguing that the Axis powers didn't really represent a threat, that market forces alone would solve the problem, that individual action rather than collective effort was sufficient. This clarity enabled the total mobilization of industrial capacity in ways that are extremely difficult to replicate for challenges that seem less immediate, where the solutions are more complex and contested, where powerful interests benefit from inaction, and where the costs are diffuse while benefits are concentrated. Climate change represents an existential threat to human civilization, comparable in ultimate scope to World War II, but it operates on a different timescale that makes mobilization politically difficult. The consequences unfold over decades rather than months, with specific disasters like hurricanes and wildfires being attributable to climate change only statistically rather than definitively. This creates space for denial and delay that didn't exist with military threats. Infrastructure decay threatens economic competitiveness and quality of life, but crumbling bridges and outdated electrical grids don't inspire the same visceral response as enemy bombers overhead. Poverty harms tens of millions of Americans and weakens the nation economically and socially, but addressing it requires confronting uncomfortable questions about economic systems, inequality, and redistribution that World War II's clearer moral framework didn't demand in the same way. But the war also proved something profound about human potential that transcends specific historical circumstances and speaks to permanent truths about what humans can accomplish. When properly organized, motivated, and supported, Ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things beyond what seemed possible. The workers at Willow Run weren't superhuman. They possessed no special abilities or characteristics that distinguished them from people today. They were regular Americans, no stronger or smarter than contemporary citizens, who rose to meet an unprecedented challenge because circumstances demanded it and leadership facilitated it. They worked longer hours than they thought possible, enduring exhaustion and danger. They mastered skills they never imagined learning, absorbing training in weeks that would normally take years. They accomplished feats that experts had deemed impossible, shattering production records that had been considered absolute limits. They did this not because they were unique or exceptional as individuals, but because they were given a clear purpose that transcended individual interest, adequate resources to accomplish their tasks, leadership that organized efforts effectively, and the deep conviction that their work mattered and would determine whether freedom or tyranny prevailed. This lesson transcends World War II and speaks to fundamental questions about human capability and social organization that remain relevant today. What might humanity accomplish if we approached other challenges, epidemic disease, environmental destruction, poverty, ignorance, with the same urgency, coordination, and resource commitment that America brought to war production? The workers in overalls who built bombers demonstrated conclusively that the limiting factor isn't human capability or available resources. It's collective will, political leadership, and the social structures we create to channel human energy towards shared goals. The resources exist. The human capability exists. What's often lacking is the clarity of purpose, the consensus about necessity, and the willingness to subordinate individual interests to collective survival that World War II temporarily created. The workers who built America's arsenal of democracy didn't receive ticker-tape parades when the war ended, and they returned to civilian life. History books devote far more pages to generals and battles, to military strategy and combat operations, than to factory shifts and production records that made those operations possible. There are no monuments on the National Mall to the women who welded ship hulls through long night shifts, or the men who assembled bomber wing sections with aching hands and tired eyes. Walk through any war memorial in any American city, and you'll find names of soldiers who died in combat, tributes to military units and their campaigns, displays of weapons and equipment preserved as artifacts. But you won't find monuments to the machinists who made those weapons with such precision, the welders who built those ships so quickly, the assembly line workers who produced the equipment that made victory possible and gave soldiers the tools they needed to come home alive. These warriors remain largely forgotten in popular memory and official commemoration, their contributions overshadowed by more dramatic stories of combat heroism and sacrifice that dominate World War II narratives. This forgetting represents a profound injustice because it misunderstands how the war was actually won. But make no mistake about the historical reality. These workers won World War II as surely as any soldier, sailor, or airman who fought in combat. Every bomb dropped on Nazi Germany that destroyed war factories and disrupted production was built by their hands in American facilities. Every ship that carried supplies across the Atlantic, running the gauntlet of submarine wolf packs to sustain Britain and supply the Soviet Union, was welded by their labor in shipyards working around the clock. Every tank that liberated a concentration camp and freed prisoners from Nazi horror, every plane that achieved air superiority and protected ground forces, every bullet that defended freedom and defeated tyranny, all of it depended absolutely on the workers who showed up for shift after shift after shift, who sacrificed their safety and comfort and time with families, who transformed America's industrial might into the physical instruments of victory through skill and determination and sheer persistence. The story of Willow Run and America's industrial mobilization deserves to be remembered not merely as historical footnote or interesting sidebar, but as central to understanding how the war was actually won. Military historians debate strategy and tactics endlessly, comparing generals and analyzing battles, discussing leadership qualities and strategic decisions. These discussions have value and contribute to understanding military operations, but they miss the fundamental point that should be obvious. World War II was won before most battles were fought, decided in the factories of Detroit and shipyards of California and steel mills of Pittsburgh, determined by production capacity and industrial organization rather than purely military factors. The side that could produce more weapons, more ammunition, more equipment would win unless military incompetence squandered that advantage, which fortunately America avoided. Consider the alternative history, where America failed to mobilize its industry effectively, where bureaucratic dysfunction or labor unrest or resource misallocation prevented adequate production, where factories continued producing automobiles and refrigerators and other consumer goods, while Germany and Japan armed themselves and conquered territories, where production bottlenecks prevented adequate equipment from reaching soldiers who desperately needed it, where shortages of aircraft meant losing air superiority to enemies who controlled the skies, shortages of ships meant losing the Atlantic to submarines that severed supply lines, shortages of tanks meant losing ground campaigns to enemies with superior armor. In this alternative history, American soldiers would have fought with extraordinary bravery, just as they did in actual history. American generals would have planned campaigns just as carefully and led just as competently. But they would have fought with inadequate equipment, insufficient supplies, obsolete weapons that couldn't match enemy capabilities. And ultimately, they would have lost, or at best fought, to bloody stalemate that left fascism controlling vast territories and millions of people. But this alternative didn't occur because ordinary Americans in overalls and work boots, women in welding masks and men in hard hats, teenagers learning skilled trades and elderly workers returning to factories they thought they'd left forever, performed an extraordinary feat unprecedented in human history. They took an economy designed for peace and consumer satisfaction, an industrial system oriented toward automobiles and appliances and civilian goods, and transformed it into a war machine that produced more weapons, more equipment, more of everything than all other combatants combined. They worked around the clock in shifts that blurred together, sacrificing their health through exposure to dangerous materials and conditions, giving up their time with families and missing children's milestones and anniversaries, sometimes losing their lives in industrial accidents that were inevitable given the pace and scale of production, all to ensure that American soldiers had what they needed to win and come home alive. They asked for no glory, expected no fame, wanted only to contribute to victory and then return to normal civilian life and the families they'd been supporting. Most did exactly that when peace finally came, returning to quiet civilian existence once the war ended, their wartime service becoming family stories shared with children and grandchildren rather than national legends celebrated in monuments and ceremonies. This quiet return to normalcy speaks to their character. They didn't seek recognition, didn't demand celebration, simply did what needed doing, then went back to their lives. The workers at Willow Run who built a bomber in 55 minutes represented the culmination and symbol of everything that made America's industrial mobilization successful. They demonstrated conclusively that Americans could match anyone in the world in skill and technical capability and exceed everyone in production efficiency and scale. They showed that mass production techniques, often dismissed by European craftsmen and traditional manufacturers as suitable only for simple consumer goods, unworthy of serious engineering attention, could be adapted to produce the most complex weapons of modern warfare with quality and precision equal to traditional methods. They proved that America's industrial system, for all its flaws and inequalities and injustices that cannot be excused, possessed fundamental capabilities that totalitarian regimes couldn't match, despite propaganda about superior discipline, organization, and dedication. When you consider that many of these same workers had been unemployed just years earlier during the Depression, living on relief or scraping by with odd jobs, written off by society as surplus labor with no productive role, the achievement becomes even more remarkable and reveals profound truths about human potential. The Depression had been economically devastating and psychologically crushing, convincing many Americans that the nation's best days were behind it, that the economy was permanently broken, that capitalism had failed, that millions would remain jobless indefinitely. Then came the war, and suddenly every worker was desperately needed, every pair of hands valuable, every bit of skill and effort essential. America took people who had been dismissed as useless, gave them training and purpose and decent wages, and watched them become the most productive workforce in human history, accomplishing feats that experts had declared impossible. This speaks to something profound about human potential and the critical importance of providing people with opportunity, dignity, and meaningful work that contributes to purposes larger than individual survival. These workers proved that human capability was never the limiting factor. social organization and economic structures were. Given proper opportunity and purpose, ordinary people accomplished the extraordinary. The lessons extend beyond World War II into fundamental questions about how societies function and what humans can accomplish when we organize ourselves effectively around shared goals. The workers who built bombers in weekends showed what humans can achieve when organized around clear purpose that transcends individual interest. They demonstrated that gender, race, and background are poor predictors of capability, that women can weld as well as men when given training and opportunity, that black workers can operate complex machinery as skillfully as white workers when not held back by discrimination, that teenagers can master technical tasks as thoroughly as adults when properly taught. They proved that American democracy and capitalism, despite profound flaws that must never be minimized or excused or forgotten, possessed strengths that enabled achievements beyond what authoritarian systems could match through coercion and terror. And they showed that ordinary people, given extraordinary circumstances and proper support and leadership, could become heroes without ever firing a shot or winning a medal or seeing combat. These are the heroes who wore overalls instead of uniforms, who wielded riveting guns instead of rifles, who fought their battles on factory floors instead of foreign fields. They won their war just as decisively as any combat unit, and their victory made all other victories possible. They were the arsenal of democracy, and democracy survived because of them. The woman welding at midnight in a Kaiser shipyard, working through bone-deep exhaustion because she knew the next shift's work depended on her completing her section properly. The teenager operating a lathe at Willow Run, with hands steady despite youth and limited experience, because aircraft lives depended on precision that couldn't tolerate mistakes. The elderly machinist who came out of retirement to work at Chrysler, decades of experience suddenly invaluable again, teaching younger workers the subtle skills that made the difference between adequate work and excellence. The black worker facing discrimination and hostility daily, but showing up anyway because defeating fascism mattered more than personal comfort or dignity. The mother juggling exhausting factory work and childcare with minimal support, sleeping in brief snatches, driven by knowledge that her labor kept soldiers supplied and might bring the war to faster conclusion, bringing her own sons home sooner and alive. These were the warriors who ensured that evil would not prevail, that freedom would endure, that the world would not fall into darkness. They deserve to be remembered as warriors, as heroes, as the essential foundation upon which victory was built. Not all heroes wore uniforms. Some wore overalls and built bombers in one weekend, and they won the war.